Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor. I'm a strategist here at the Garage Group. And the Garage Group is an innovation and growth strategy company that helps big companies operate more like a startup would. So we help companies through their toughest innovation and growth challenges to do things in a more entrepreneurial way. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Todd to introduce himself as well.
Hey, everybody. My name is Todd Henry. I am founder of Accidental Creative, also the author of several books, including The Accidental Creative, Die Empty, Louder Than Words, and the new book we're going to talk about today, which is called Herding Tigers, which is not in reverse when you see it in life. It only looks that way on Facebook Live.
So just to give a quick background, a few weeks back, our team here at the Garage Group read Todd's new book, Herding Tigers, and we loved it. We ended up having a book club on our own and came up with a few key big questions that we wanted to ask Todd today. And then we'll also be taking live questions from you guys. So as you're viewing, feel free to comment on this Facebook Live, and we'll be answering your questions right around halfway through this session. So I'm going to jump right in and ask Todd our first question, which was, most importantly, our team is really interested in knowing in how many tigers were actually herded in the process of writing this book.
Only one, just the one that's on the chair on the cover.
Oh, gotcha.
And it took them like a half hour to get the tiger to sit still. It's crazy. No, the title is Herding Tigers. Actually, I was kind of dragged, not kicking and screaming, but I was not in love with the title initially. It was just a line in the book. So I was speaking at a conference about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, and off the cuff, I kind of said, how many of you have ever heard the phrase that leading creatives is like herding cats, right? And everybody raised their hand and said, it's not. It's a terrible phrase. It's demeaning. It's actually more like herding tigers, right? Because these are powerful, majestic creatures that are capable of incredible feats of wonder, and then the next moment they can turn around and rip you to shreds if you don't lead them properly. And everybody laughed. I thought, oh, that's a good line. I should put that in the book. And then my editor, Nikki Papadopoulos at Portfolio, said that has to be the title. Has to be the title. I'm like, really? Okay. So we ended up making that the title of the book. And it's funny because like that is, people have really loved the title of the book, but really I wanted to communicate value to the creative class, to the people who are, the tigers in this scenario, because I think that often there are misunderstandings, myths about creative people and what it is that they need and how they function, how they behave. And I want to sort of reclaim some of those narratives and say, actually, nice try, but that's not really the way it is, and just offer a little bit more perspective about what it is really the creative people need.
Yeah, sure.
Organizations.
So I know this book is specifically geared towards creatives, but we've, of course, found it super applicable to what we do across different business functions. So how have you kind of seen the reaction, or how would you speak to those who maybe aren't in a creative position?
Well, so I think one of the challenges is that we often conflate creativity with art, right? So I hear people say all the time, well, I'm not creative. I'm like, well, what do you do? Well, I'm a marketing manager at a company. What do you mean you're not creative? Or like, oh, I'm a sales manager. What do you mean you're not creative? Like, you have to solve problems every single day. That's what you do. And if you're solving problems, you're being creative. That's what creativity is. Now, a designer will solve problems by designing something, right? But an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur, right, has to solve problems by identifying a white space, an area of white space, right? Something, and build a solution that can help solve that problem, or identify a need or a pain point or something like that. You're solving problems, you're being creative. And so the reality is most of us have to be creative on a daily basis as a function of our job, because we have to solve problems. And so I would argue that the principles in this book apply to any group of people who is trying to do largely uncertain work, trying to solve problems on a daily basis and have to sort of figure it out as they go. That's really who the book was written for. So the tag creative, I think, applies more broadly than we often give it credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. So what really inspired you to write Herding Tigers in the first place?
So, there are a lot of books out there about leadership, about management, about how to lead companies effectively. But I'd not really encountered many books that were targeted specifically at the needs of highly creative teams. What is it that talented creative people need from managers or from leaders? And also the other thing that really sort of sparked me to write the book was that a lot of times people are thrown into positions of leadership or management because they're a really great tactician. So, so for example, in like the agency world, you have somebody who's a designer and say, hey, you're a really good designer. You know what you should do? You should lead other designers. Well, maybe, but like, I'm just really great as a tactician, I've been really great at getting the product right and controlling it, making it what it needs to be. But the moment that you transition to a leadership role, your job is no longer just about doing the work. Your job is about leading the work, which is a fundamentally different skill set that a lot of people haven't been trained for. And so what I wanted to do was talk about from a very sort of basic level for those people, hey, here are some of the fundamentals of leading highly talented creative people that are probably different from the kinds of skills that you learned when you were a tactician. And again, that applies to really to any role. It applies to any sort of creative organization. I think many of us grow up as brilliant tacticians within our organizations, and then we're so good at doing the work that we're thrown into a leadership role. Well, maybe we're equipped for that, maybe we're not. But typically it's a learn on the job situations. We have to figure it out as we go. So I wanted to give people some baseline understanding of here are some of the conversations that need to happen. Here are some of the tactics that work really well. And here are some of the hidden dynamics we often aren't aware of until we sort of call them out and name them. And then we say, oh yeah, that's rampant in our organization, right? We just didn't know it because we didn't know how to name it. We just thought that was the way it is. Well, not necessarily. Once you name it, you can begin to develop counter strategies to deal with it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I personally love so much about this book is that unlike other leadership books, this one actually gives you so many specific things to do or frameworks to follow to actually become a better leader versus just talking in generalities or being very high level. So that's definitely something that we talked about as a group and things that we can definitely take away to apply directly to our day-to-day jobs.
It's encouraging to hear because it's sort of one of my pet peeves with the big idea leadership books is that often you're left feeling really inspired, but at the end you're like, now I'm just overwhelmed. Like, what do I do? Like, how do I apply all of this, right? And so I wanted to make it really tactical and practical because I feel like inspiration has a shelf life. Like, inspiration is great. We all need to be inspired by ideas, and we need to have big ideas and all of that. But inspiration without action has a shelf life. And so I think it's important that we have tactics, not just strategies or ideas.
Absolutely. If you guys are just joining us or joined a little bit late, feel free to comment and add your own questions as well. We're going to be taking questions from the audience in just a few minutes, so feel free to add those to the comment bar. So Todd, our third question for you, and for those that haven't read the book yet, there is a 4x4 matrix in the book all around stability and challenge. And essentially it's saying that as a leader, there are two key things that your people need from you, and that's both stability and challenge. But as more companies are learning how to pivot quickly and are encouraging quick reactions to change, curious how you would encourage leaders to still provide that stability and challenge while also being in this era of agility and learning how to pivot.
Yeah, that's a great question. So stability doesn't mean certainty of outcome, right? It doesn't mean that you're always going to know, like if we just follow this process, everything's going to be the same every single time, right? We're going to get a guaranteed result. Stability means stability of process. So when you're in a highly agile, highly fluid situation, what people in that situation need to know are what are the rules that are governing our day, or more importantly, what are the principles that we're abiding by. So that's why a leadership philosophy becomes critically important. It's important that we understand how we're engaging one another, what's expected of us, what we expect from one another. In order to have the stability, we need to be able to take risks. You cannot expect people, highly talented, creative people, to exist within an unstable process with unstable expectations where the game is constantly shifting. We have no clear boundaries or anything bounding our activity, our interactions, expectations of one another. Oh, and by the way, we also want you within that instability to create something that's highly risky and unstable. Creative people need boundaries. They need a kind of bounded autonomy, right? They need freedom, but freedom within a clear set of rails, a clear philosophy that's guiding the process. A lot of highly creative people need to be given permission to take risks. I know that seems counterintuitive because a lot of times we think of, entrepreneurs and creative types as risk takers. Inherently, they're risk takers. But the reality is many of them are somewhat risk averse. They need to be given permission to take risks, to try new things, to experiment, to push to the edge of the boundary. If they don't know where the boundary is, then they'll shrink back and they'll just hover close to the middle where they know it's safe, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to create an environment in which people feel free to take risks. They're being given permission to take risks. We see them, we know them, we understand who they are, what drives them, and we're pushing them to venture out into those uncomfortable places, but within a clear set of boundaries or within a guiding philosophy that helps them understand clearly what to expect from the process. So stability doesn't mean everything is clear. We know exactly what we're going to do. We know exactly what the outcome. I mean, that's unrealistic. And not only that, it's not very valuable, right, to our clients or to our organization. But it means that there is stability of process, that no matter what happens, I know that we're going to abide by a certain leadership philosophy in order to accomplish our objectives. And the problem with that, and you mentioned stability and challenge, the problem with that is that stability, these are the two things that highly creative people need, right? Stability and challenge. The problem is that those two things exist in tension. So as we stabilize the process, we tend to decrease the amount of challenge that people feel because things become more predictable. It's more easy to understand what's happening. And, there's not that sort of thrill of that we're living right on the edge that a lot of, talented creative people sort of live on.
Yeah.
But as you increase the amount of challenge, you decrease the amount of stability. And different people on your team are going to need a different balance of stability and challenge. So you need to understand not just as a whole, sort of where do we fit on that matrix of stability and challenge, but what is it the individuals on my team need in order to be able to thrive? Because it's going to be different for different people. Some people need more hand-holding. They need to be told, hey, it's okay. No, go do that. I want you to go do that. And they're brilliant when they do, but they just need an extra measure of permission. Whereas other people, you're going to have to put a leash on and say, oh, hold on there, Tex, right? Like you're getting out ahead of us a little bit. Why don't you come back, join the group? Let's talk this through together. So that's where the sort of the boundaries of a guiding philosophy help tremendously, because people know even when all chaos is breaking loose, it's really clear what our terms of engagement are on the team.
So as a leader, you both need to know what your stability of process is across the entire, what we stand for as a company or as a team, but also on an individual level, what is this person's levers of stability and challenge, and what is this person's levers of stability and challenge? That's
right, which is really hard because, again, it means you have to know your people. This is why doing the work and leading the work are fundamentally different skill sets, because if your only mission as a leader is let's just make great work, and you're not really getting to know your team and understanding what makes them tick and what drives them and what allows them to do their best work, then you're going to be burning through people left and right, and you're not even going to know why. Like, it could be because they didn't have enough stability, because you were just charging ahead without giving them clarity of process. It could be because they weren't challenged enough, so they felt bored and stuck because there was too much stability of process.
Yeah.
You won't even know, but people will be leaving. And so that's why if you want to unleash the best of your team, you have to not only know as a whole, like, what is our guiding philosophy as a team, but what levels of stability and challenge do the individuals on my team need?
Yeah, we were saying as we were reading this book too, that it would be interesting to do some kind of a case study on, even just for our team, why everyone left their old roles or old companies and which part of the matrix they fell into, so that we could kind of assess where everyone is falling into here at TGG and how leaders can be most helpful on the stability and challenge piece as well.
Yeah, and if people are looking to self-diagnose that in that matrix that we keep referencing that nobody can see, it's probably frustrating as heck, because it's like, it's in there, trust me, it's in there. Stability and challenge, right, are on a matrix. When you have an environment where you have high challenge but low stability, so you're sprinting after something, but nobody has any clue like what our terms of engagement are, what the philosophy is, it's guiding our process, all of those things. Those teams tend to get angry, right? If you have a lot of angry people on your team and they can't really pinpoint why they're angry, but they just seem constantly frustrated and angry with you, it could be because you're challenging them without any accompanying level of stability. I call these shooting star organizations because they do really well for a while because they're doing often really good work, like really important work, but they just can't sustain the pace because there's no clarity of process. So if you have low stability, low challenge, then these people are lost. So if you find that people in your organization are just like, what do we do? Why am I here? Those organizations don't tend to stick around for very long. If you have high stability, low challenge, team members might reflect that they feel stuck. the work's fine. It's okay, you know, but I just don't feel challenged. I don't feel like I'm doing work that matters. And as a leader, that's part of your job, is to identify that and say, hey, let's figure out a way to give you something in your portfolio of work that will challenge you a bit more, that will push you a little bit, to take some risks and try some new things. Maybe not your entire job, because we don't get to control the entire mix of our work, right? But something, you have to have something in your role in your life that will challenge you and push you. And of course, when we have the right mix of stability, challenge, this is where organizations thrive. This is what we aim for. So.
Great. All right, our next question was, the book talks in one of the chapters about how your title and role at work should not be closely tied to your own personal identity. But as we know, in many company cultures, especially big companies, incentives, authority, your influence, all of those are very much closely tied to your title and role. So what would be your encouragement or advice for entrepreneurs to disconnect that personal identity from their specific title in order to take on better, more calculated risks at work?
Yeah, so this is such a great question, right? Because we've all seen people who become subsumed into their role organizationally, especially as you become more and more significant, you wield more organizational power, you become sucked into the organization to the point that you can no longer see a difference between the organization and the person. You just become basically an agent acting on behalf of the organization. And I think it's profoundly sad when that happens. I think it's a little bit reductive and maybe even naive when I hear people say, you know, well, you are not your work. You know, your work is not your identity. Well, yeah, I mean, in theory, absolutely. But I do think that, you know, it's really difficult to parse who you are from the value you put into the world, especially when you're doing creative work that's largely tied to your creative intuition, to how you perceive yourself in the world and the value that you put out into the world. You know, a rejection of your work is not a rejection of you as a human being, but it is a rejection of your perspective, of your intuition, of your decision making, right? And so, yeah, you are not your work, but to some degree, it's difficult to parse your creative intuition and how you see your role in the world from the product you put out into the world. So I agree with that completely, that's the case. But I think that one of the things that happens is as we become known for something, you know, we take ground, we try new things, we take risks, we become known for something, all of a sudden it's really easy for us to turn around and become very protective of that thing we've become known for, and we stop growing. We stop taking risks because it becomes more about protecting the ground we've already taken than taking new ground. And there's kind of a growth curve. I wrote about this in my book, Louder Than Words, a growth curve that we follow as we progress in our career. And it begins with, you know, maybe learning a new skill, trying a new thing, taking a new job. And then we always learn by emulating other people around us, right? By imitating what they do that works really well. And most of us have a manager or a mentor early in our career that kind of shows us the ropes, right? And early in our career as a manager, we start emulating those people typically. That's kind of how we learn how to manage. And then at some point we begin to find our stride and develop our own unique voice. And that's when we begin taking risks and trying new things and following our intuition. And this is when we sail perpendicular to the shoreline. This is often where we experience tremendous career growth, is when this happens. We begin becoming known for a thing, which is great, right? In theory, except the moment we become known for a thing, it's a really dangerous place for us because we inevitably hit a point where, and I call this crisis phase, where we begin to top off, right? Where what we've been doing is no longer sufficient to get us to where we want to go. And I call it crisis phase because for most people, looking at our career, it looks like everything's great. It looks like we're doing great. We're knocking it out of the park. Everything is wonderful, right? I mean, we're still doing what we've always done. To most people, it looks like we're still performing at our peak. But deep down, we know, we have this sense that we've begun to phone it in. We know that we're not any longer taking the kinds of risks that excite us, that are causing us to grow, to try new things. And this, by the way, applies to companies as well, right? And so we have two choices that we can make when we hit that stall. We can either begin a new growth curve, which means going all the way back to discovery phase, learning something new, trying something new, emulating other people, being willing to fail in the process, or we can begin down the backside of the curve, because if we're not growing, eventually we're going And so I think for people who feel like they're in that place where I'm not taking risks, I'm not trying new things, it could very well be that you're in crisis phase. If that's your organization, by the way, if your organization's in a place where you're a one product wonder and you're sort of out there and you're hammering that product, but at some point, if we don't continue to grow and try new things and experiment and diversify, we're going to begin down the back end of the curve. You need to have some kind of a skunkworks type of area in your life, in your career, in your organization, where you're playing around, developing new products, trying new things, experimenting, risking, failing, in order to begin that new curve. Because if you don't, eventually you're going to die. So the key to decoupling yourself from that risk aversion is a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to fail, a willingness to decouple yourself from the thing that you're known for and to try something maybe that other people think is risky, but that excites you in the same way that early idea that got you where you are excited you. To some degree, you just have to be humble enough to say, if I fail, I fail, and I'm going to wear it as a badge of honor, and I'm going to move forward. Failure is never the goal. I can't. It drives me crazy when I hear people say, let's fail. We want to fail, right? Let's rush into failure. No, failure is not the goal. I mean, failure is a byproduct of trying difficult things. So you're going to fail. If you're trying hard enough, eventually you're going to fail. That's great. But failure is never the goal, and failure is not a badge of honor to wear, right? It's like something you learn from. You move on. You apply those learnings moving forward. But if you're not regularly failing in your career or as an organization in some capacity, then you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough, and you're probably falling prey to this, identity coupling that is causing you to shrink back from what you're capable of.
Yeah. I'm curious, in either your experience or in talking with other businesses and leaders, is there a certain level that you see people stop learning or stop seeking mentors or stop trying new things? Is it more at a lower level or mid-level, or is it more senior managers?
There's not necessarily a pattern, but I will tell you that I hear about it from senior managers more than I hear about it from mid-level managers. I think that we tend to err on the side of optimism with our career, like things are going to get better. Like the great thing is right around the corner. By the time you get to the point in your life and your career where you realize, oh, this is kind of what it is, you become more of a realist. And I hear about it from people who are at that level of their career when they realize, listen, the time that you need people around you to speak truth to you career-wise is before you realize that you need people around you to speak truth to you career-wise. And I hear this all the time from people, like, I don't have anybody who can speak truth to me, from senior level managers. And I'm talking like really super high up in large organizations. I feel like there's somebody who will speak truth to me. Well, the time to begin building those relationships is 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's not now because it's going to be really hard to find those people. You need people who know you, who have seen you at your worst, at your best. I mean, you need people early in your career who are willing to say to you, hey, I know you're excited about this idea. It seems like a great idea for somebody else, but this is not an idea for you, right? Or somebody who can say, hey, I know you're not excited about this, but knowing you and seeing you and understanding your patterns, you need to do this. You need to take this risk. I know you don't want to, you don't think you should, but you need to take this risk because this, if you don't, you will find all kinds of people who will give you advice for all kinds of reasons, right? Especially later in your career. And you'll find people who will tell you to do something just because they want to see if you fail, right? Oh, sure, you should absolutely do that. You'd be great. They don't care about you. They just want to see what happens, You need people who are willing to speak truth to you and give you perspective. We are often terrible judges of the quality of our own ideas and the quality of our own work and the quality of our own potential, right? We often don't understand our own potential. And so we need other people around us who can speak truth to us in that way.
Yeah, that's great. Do you find that as you, even outside of your business experience, as you look to start being an author, write books, were you finding leadership and mentors in different ways or seeking advice on your own?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there have been a number of people who have been instrumental in helping me think through career decisions, creative decisions. I mean, there are a handful. I was texting last night with someone who was, we are regularly telling one another what we're seeing, what we're observing. Hey, why are you doing this? This doesn't seem to make sense. It's a fellow person who's kind of in my same space. And it's somebody who I know has my best interests. I have their best interests in mind. And we're able to speak extremely candidly with one another about that, because we really want what's best for one another. And so I think, these people can certainly, the longer the span of their experience with you, the better, right? The longer the span of what they've seen of you, your highs, your lows, all of that, the better it's going to be for you. And so sometimes it's good to go back to people that you've been working with for 5 or 7 years or 10 years and that know you, and they've seen the decisions you've made, and they've, all of those kinds of things. But, if you can't identify those people, you need to find someone in your world who's willing to play that role for you.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. All right, moving on to our next question. The book talks a lot about strategic coaching and leadership using various check-ins and goal setting with your direct reports. But curious how you see different cross-functional teams or team members who may not necessarily be in a position of leadership to still effectively lead and influence each other, but maybe more on a day-to-day or informal basis rather than a formal check-in with your aligned manager.
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and it really gets to the heart of the culture of the organization, right? Like, what kind of culture are we defining here for ourselves? You need to have a culture of permission, where people feel freedom to speak truth to one another, to call out things without other people getting offended by what they're saying, and a culture where we all recognize what we're trying to do, not just what we're doing, but why it's important. Why what we're doing is important, and then clarity of process. Here are the terms of engagement. So I think you have to create a culture of permission where we can speak truth to one another about what we're seeing and what we expect of one another. And also, hey, you violated an expectation I had. Can we talk about what happened and why it happened? Because nobody is served when we sweep those things under the rug. But I think also the other thing that's really important for teams in that scenario is that you have to handle conflict well. And I don't know, but I'm sure that in the work that you've seen this a lot, but there's this kind of common misnomer in the workplace that a lack of conflict signals health on the team. I once had a manager tell me, hey, we're about the healthiest team you ever meet. Like, we never fight. Like, you're the most dysfunctional organization. How could you even say that? That there was conflict. It said the conflict was being swept under the rug. Nobody was fighting. Conflict is the natural result of highly talented, highly driven people bumping into one another. If you hire properly, you're going to have conflict on your team. It's going to happen. If it doesn't happen, it's a signal of a lack of accountability. Nobody feels like they really are accountable for bringing anything to the table. They're just kind of phoning it in, right? B, they've already given up. They don't care. People don't really care. Or C, there's a culture of fear on your team where people feel like if I voice my opinion, then it's not going to be valid anyway, or somebody's going to make fun of me, or you're going to go with somebody else, or I'm going to get dinged for it. Tallest blade of grass gets cut kind of syndrome. Yeah. Which is very possible. Or 4, as a manager, you've been so controlling of the team, and you are trying to control the work to the point that people are just waiting for you to tell them what to do anyway, right? So they're just waiting to see what you say before they act. But if you have created a culture of permission, and you've created a culture where people feel free to speak to one another what they're seeing, not what they think you want them to see, but what they're actually seeing, there's going to be conflict, but you have to handle that properly. So there are a couple of principles that seem to work really well for teams when it comes to handling conflict. The first principle is make sure that you're fighting over ideas, not personality. And this happens especially at a lot of larger bureaucratic organizations where you have these cults of personality emerge, where well, I'm with this person, well, I'm with that person, and then those sort of factions kind of war against one another, and it becomes a political game, career-based political game that people are fighting. I mean, it's just silly, right? Like, we're not getting anything done when that happens. And I mean, we see a lot of that happening, not just in business, but in the political spectrum and all that. So we're fighting over ideas. We need to agree from the beginning that, listen, this is about getting to the best idea. I don't care where the idea comes from. I don't care who proposed it, whatever. Like, we're getting to the best idea. So are you fighting over ideas, or is it becoming personal, right? I don't like that idea is different from those are stupid shoes, right? Don't cross that line. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you want to make sure that you're agreeing on common ground from the start, right? So are we fighting over the same thing? It's very possible that you're fighting over different things. You're not even having the same argument. I see things one way, you see things another way, and we're arguing right past each other. So let's agree, okay, this is actually what we're trying to do. Are we solving the same problem? Oh, we're actually solving a different problem. Oh, Well, okay, of course we disagree, right? Because we see the problem differently. Let's get to a common definition of the problem first, right? Before we start arguing about our perspective. And then the third thing, the third key, and this is critical for building empathy within teams, is identify the good in the other person's idea before you seek to destroy the person's idea. So I want you to make the argument for me. I'm going to pair it back to you what I like about your thought, about your approach. Seek the good, and then they'll do the same for you. And then you can talk about your points of specific disagreement rather than just dismissing ideas wholesale. Mm-hmm. Now, I know it sounds very naive, it sounds very Pollyanna-ish, right? Like, oh, and then we all get along. No, I mean, we're still going to have friction and conflict. If you're creating a culture of permission, that's going to happen because people are going to speak their mind. That's great. That's what you hired them for, right? You want them to speak their mind, but you have to have some rules that govern your conflict. And you also, if you're leading a team of people, you have to make certain that you're not confusing permission to offer input with permission to make a decision. So you have to be very clear about, I want input. I want you guys to argue, everybody to argue their perspective. But just because I'm soliciting input or your opinion doesn't mean that I'm going to take your opinion. Mm-hmm. And this can be very confusing, especially for people who are early in their career. They confuse a willingness to listen to an idea with, oh, and you're obviously going to do what I say because I'm right. Mm-hmm. No, not necessarily. Right? There are all kinds of other factors. So you have to make sure that you're communicating clearly that permission to speak doesn't mean permission to make the decision. So sure. I think if all of those things are in place, I think it makes it a lot easier for collaboration to run smoothly within highly fluid organizations.
Yeah. You mentioned empathy in leadership, and empathy is something that we talk a lot about here and we talk with our clients about as well. And there's a common misconception that empathy is this touchy-feely thing that you turn into sort of the office therapist or something, when really that couldn't be further from the truth. So curious how you see empathy coinciding with leadership.
Yeah, I think, the first key, I think, in any capacity to developing empathy is just listening, which is that's just, I think, leadership 101, right? The willingness to listen to what's going on your team. I mean, any leader needs to do that. But listening for patterns, I think, is the key thing. Like, what patterns am I hearing coming up in conversation that are signifying either something I'm doing wrong as a leader, signifying something that's an area of confusion maybe on the team, signifying an area of potential conflict that's going to be emerging soon. When you listen with an empathetic ear, and most of us have been in that place. We know what it feels like to be on a team, to be in the dark, to not know what's going on, to really put yourself in that position and not jump to conclusions and assume that because you see more, that what's going on, but instead to really listen, to try to identify, to try to put yourself in that position and to think, okay, what might be going on here that I'm not seeing because I don't have the same perspective. And then to try to communicate in a way that, that in some way connects on that level of common understanding of what the problem really is. And by the way, sometimes that doesn't mean, like you said, it's not this touchy-feely thing where it's like, oh, I really feel for you. Sometimes it's, hey, I understand it's really hard, and I felt that way recently. And you know what? We need to suck it up. We need to push through this because I know I've been here. The only way through this is to suck it up and to push through and to figure it out. And you know what? We might be thoroughly embarrassed, and that's okay because we have to. The only way we're going to know is if we push through. Speaking truth in a difficult, tough, but caring way is empathy for people. And so. Sometimes the things we need to hear are the hardest words to hear. So I would say, that we have to, it begins by listening, which means spending time with your team, which a friend of mine, Michael Bungay Stanier, wrote a book called The Coaching Habit. And it's a brilliant book. For those of you who haven't read it, you should absolutely read that book. And if you read that one instead of Herding Tigers, I will fully forgive you for doing that. Read them both. But Michael says most leaders view coaching as okay, sit down, I'm going to tell you what needs to happen kind of thing. And he said, no, coaching is about listening. It's about asking a question and then sitting and listening. And really what you're doing is you're listening for patterns. You're listening with empathy. You're trying to bring yourself fully to the conversation, but you're doing it by listening, not by telling other people what to do. So I think empathy is like the ante up for leadership, right? Like you have to be able to listen to your team or to be able to lead that approach.
So one last question before we jump into other questions from you all. Finally, if you had to sum up one key takeaway from the book that you could fit on a tiny Post-it, what would it be? What would you prioritize for people as the one thing to take away from reading this book?
Okay, well, can I do two?
Sure.
Okay, because I had an initial idea, but so the one thing early in the book, and I actually made a download for people that says, how will this affect the work, right? So as a leader, you have a long lever, right? Everything you do moves more rocks than other people in the organization. And the more your authority, the longer that lever is. So every tiny little move of that lever moves a whole lot of soil at that point. So you have to be considering every time you make a decision, how is this going to affect the capital W work of the organization? Something that doesn't seem significant to you could have massive ripple effects by the time it gets to lower levels of the organization. So when you make a decision before hitting the keystroke to, whatever, step back and ask, how is this decision going to affect the capital W work, the work of the organization, the work of the people that are going to be impacted by this, and make sure that the price they're going to pay is going to be worth it. Sometimes we can live in our own little bubble as a leader, and it makes sense. Everything makes sense rationally, and we think we have a good understanding. We're not really stopping to think, how are my actions going to affect everybody else in broad terms? So that'd be the first thing. The second thing is you have to define what success looks like for you as a leader. And you have to define that before you're in pressure-tested situations, when you're tempted to compromise. So I was in New York speaking at a company probably last year, maybe a year and a half ago, and I was walking down Broadway, and I heard this group of people come out of a building. I wrote about this in Herding Tigers, but a group of people come out of a building, and I just overheard the last bit of this conversation where this guy said, well, what did you do? And this woman said, I lied to the Pope. I had no choice. Right? I'm like, you what? He was like record scratch. What? And I was like, they were gone. I have no idea what they were talking about. But I started thinking, I was like, in what world do you find yourself in a situation where you feel like you have no choice but to lie to the Pope, right? Like face to face, like what? Like what do you, I don't even know what that means. But I guarantee you that if that ever happens, it's not a game time decision, right? Like you have made small compromises along the way to get you to that point. So when you're in that moment of testing, of pressure, you're going to compromise. So as a leader, you have to have some framework by which you make decisions, some framework by which you determine, when am I going to do the hard thing that's going to impact me personally because it's the right thing for the organization, right? What am I willing to compromise? What am I never willing to compromise? And, we see people who, and I'm sure that you've seen this as well, people who get to a certain point in their career where they feel like now there's so much in that, and their career has taken so much from them that, well, what's one more little thing? What's one more little thing? What's one more little thing, right? And then they get to a point where like, they're really successful in their organization and their family is in shambles and their friends haven't talked to them in 5 years, and they have a shell of a life outside of whatever identity they've carved for themselves inside of their organization. And it's a profoundly sad thing to the rest of the world. Everybody's saying, great job, right? And they realize that they've compromised and sacrificed everything in order to get there. And by the way, there are other people who are able to climb that corporate ladder and they have a remarkably healthy family and great friendships and good hobbies, and they somehow managed to do that. It's not by accident. It's not that there's some special species of human beings. It's that they determined early on, here's what I'm not willing to compromise in order to accomplish my leadership goals. And that's really what the last chapter of the book is about. It's about identifying that framework. So I would just encourage people, if you don't have some framework by which your life and career decisions are made, you need to develop that now before it's battle tested, because if you're making those decisions in the moment, you're going to compromise, and you might compromise in a way that affects you for many, many years to come. So I know that feels a little touchy-feely for what we're talking about today, but I think that's really
actually a good segue into our first question. So if you joined late, we're actually taking questions from your comments. So go ahead and comment on this Facebook Live here. And this first question actually came in over Instagram from Pamela. And she said, once you determine your own leadership style, how much should you change your own leadership style to adapt to your company's way of working? For example, my style is to lead by coaching, but my last organization wanted me to manage.
Well, so I would be curious, and I know we can't ask follow-up question, I'd be curious to know what the difference is between managing and coaching. I think that those two are very closely coupled, right? Like when you're managing someone, you need to understand what's going on with them. You need to understand what's happening in their world. But that is a really great question. I think that you have to answer that question for yourself, and it sounds like a cop out, right? But there was I always tell this story when I'm speaking to a group. There was a guy who was invited to be the opening act for this massively popular band, right, drawing thousands of people all over the country, and this guy's performing, and he's booed by all these people, on stage, booed off stage. This happened night after night after night. Anyway, it turns out that the guy was Jimi Hendrix, and he was opening for the Monkees, right? This is early in his career. And, the funny thing is, like, if you were present when you saw Jimi Hendrix being booed off stage, you might have thought, what a failure. Like, this is one of the worst disasters in music history. But the reality is, if you look at the relative impact Jimi Hendrix has had compared to the Monkees on the history of rock and roll, I mean, rock and roll has never been the same since Jimi Hendrix. He completely transformed the way that guitarists think about playing guitar, right? The Monkees were fine. The Monkees were like down the middle, pop, whatever. It's fine. It has its place, but it certainly didn't transform rock and roll history, right? Mm-hmm. Jimi Hendrix, because in the midst of the pressure and the boos and the jeering crowds, he was willing to be who he was, even in the midst of that pressure, to compromise. It would have been really easy for him to monkey-eyes his Hendrix music to make it a little more palatable, right? And so, listen, there is a rough edge that you have as a leader, and that rough edge is what makes you valuable. The rough edge is what makes you unique. And as a company, that rough edge is what makes you endearing to your customer base, right? To the people, to your fierce fans. It's the rough edges. If you try to round yourself off to make you more like whatever the big conglomerate is that you're chasing, whatever that definition of success is, you might experience some success for a while, but you're going to sell out the very part of you that makes you unique. And so, I would encourage you, as you think about your career, now in the short term, this may not be a solution, but in the long term, you want to find an organization that lets you bring those rough edges to the table. Because in the end, if you compromise those rough edges, you're going to compromise your effectiveness as well. If you're compromising your creative intuition, all those things in order to fit in somewhere, yeah, you're going to fit in for a while there, but are you really bringing the value to the table you're capable of bringing? And so I think it's just permission to embrace those rough edges. I mean, I'm not talking about, if you're just obviously openly annoying and you don't know when to shut your mouth, whatever, but I'm talking about like the parts of you, your intuition, your perspective, the productive passion that makes you unique. And that word passion is misunderstood. We talk about it in terms of something I like or something I'm interested in, but the word passion comes from the root word that means to suffer. So there are certain things that are a part of how we see our role in the world. We say, hey, I care so much about this outcome or this thing or the way that I approach this. I'm willing to suffer if necessary on behalf of this outcome because it matters so much to me. Mm-hmm. If there's something like that in your world and your company is telling you to compromise that, I would say there's nothing in this world that is worth compromising that through line, that productive passion, in order to have a job for a little while longer or whatever it is, right? Like, figure out a way to bring that to what you do. And if you can't, and listen, there's some reasons why some people can't do that. Maybe you need to go find something else in your life that lets you pursue that productive passion, a different outlet for it, because your job, this is one of the common things I see with creative people is, they're looking for their job to be the sum total of their creative expression. It's never going to happen. Never going to happen. I mean, no matter how perfect your job is, you're always going to have to do stuff you don't like, because you're a professional. It's what you're getting paid to do a job. So you're going to have to find something out there, some kind of secret work or, unnecessary creating where you can express that. But I would just encourage you to identify what are those battle lines in my life? What is it that makes me unique? The rough edges, the productive passion that really drives me. And if you're being asked to compromise that, then and you've been, by the way, and also you've been doing this for a while and you know who you are because you've been in your career for a while, and the company's saying, well, we like you, but we really want you to be more like this. Mm-hmm. I think you have some decisions to make, and that's why it's important to have that decision-making framework.
Absolutely. So, there you go, Pamela. Yeah,
okay,
I think that's great. All right, next question. So, giving permission to take risks inherently means your team is more likely to encounter failure.
Yes.
Can you talk about how to lead the team through failure when it inevitably happens and make sure it's a positive experience instead of a crushing one?
Yeah, and by the way, it is going to be a crushing one. I mean, it's just reality. Like sometimes, not always, but sometimes, like you work, you put your heart and your soul into something, and then it like wah, 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 right? It hurts, and you have to give people permission to grieve, right? We often don't do that. The non-empathetic way to lead is to say, hey, suck it up, come on, let's move on to the next thing. No, like, I know this really mattered to you. I know that you cared about this. That sucks. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's grieve what we thought was going to happen, and let's sort of bury it in the ground. Maybe even have a funeral for that. But I think that the main leadership principle here is, I think there are three things we have to do. Number one, we have to talk about what happened. So let's agree on a common story about what happened. Why did this fail, right? So you might find that different people on the team are telling different stories about why something failed. Okay, well, hold on, time out. Let's get to a common understanding of what actually happened. Why do we think this actually failed? Number two, what did we learn from this? So what are the core things, assumptions that we made that were invalid assumptions? Okay, well, that's instructive. Maybe what were some of the things that we anticipated would happen that didn't happen? What did we just get wrong because we didn't know enough? Like what are the things that we learned from this? And we develop a base of understanding of reality versus perception that led us to this failure. And then, okay, now what next? Okay, so we have some other work that we're moving on to. How can we apply these learnings to what's going to happen next? How can we make sure we don't make these same assumptions again? That how can we institutionalize this organizational learning so that we don't make those same assumptions moving forward? Failure is never, and this is a bit cliche, but failure is never a problem. But failing twice in the same way is a huge problem. That's a failure of leadership. Yeah. It is, right? So if you fail, fine, learn, move on. But never fail in the same way twice. Because if you do, then you're not doing your job as a leader. So what happened? What do we learn? And what next? How are we going to apply that? And then make sure that you give people permission to grieve. There's too much suck it up and move on. Like, you want people, you talk about, well, passion's important, and we want people to care about why we're doing this, and we want them to, but then we don't give them permission to grieve when things go wrong. I think that's a huge failure of leadership when that happens. You have to give people permission. You can't let them wallow in it for weeks, right? It's like, okay, well, let's talk about it. This sucks. This is terrible. We hate this. Address it. Let's grieve it. Okay, now it's time to move on, because in any process, you have to eventually move on from it. But don't act like it didn't happen. That's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, I like that. And I especially like the don't fail in the same way twice.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good, a good quote, a great motto. So failing is okay, but failing in the same way twice is not okay.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's wasted at that point, right?
Sure.
I can't remember the exact story, but like, I think it was Thomas Watson, maybe the founder of IBM or something. It's apocryphal. May not be true, but it makes a great story, right? This guy that he had hired lost like $500,000 or something. And he came in to report that to Thomas Watson, and Thomas Watson said, okay, all right, thank you for letting me know. He walked out of the room, and the other guy sitting in the room said, well, aren't you going to fire him? It's like, why would I fire him? I just paid $500,000 for his education, right? Like, I think that's the mindset we have to have. It's like, people are going to make mistakes. You get rid of people not because they make mistakes. You get rid of people because of incompetence. You get rid of people because of obstinance. They're not listening. They're not willing to listen. You get rid of people because they don't learn from their mistakes. If you see somebody making the same mistake multiple times, that means that they're not a curious person, and they don't have any interest in further development. And so at that point, you have to start saying, okay, maybe there's not a place for that person around here. Right?
Yeah.
So.
All right, I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So this next one is, what do you say to people in this stream thinking, oh man, my manager really needs to hear this? Is there a way to steer your leadership towards the principles in this book if they aren't there already?
Oh, that's a great question. I will, if you want, I'd be happy to send an anonymous copy of Herding Tigers to your manager. That is a really great, it's actually surprising. It's a question we get. Well, actually, unsurprisingly, it's a question I get a lot. Like, I know somebody else who needs to read this book, right? Or needs to hear these principles. I think if you are able to come into a meeting with your manager and say, hey, I came across this concept. I would love to know what you think about it. You don't say, hey, you really need to read this book. Because basically what you're saying is like, you don't know how to lead, and you need to, don't do that. But if there are a couple of principles from the book, like the stability challenge matrix. I mean, it's funny, like I've come in and I've presented this to teams, and they've said like that alone, that was worth bringing you in just to have some grid for having those conversations about like why we feel the way we feel organizationally. So maybe it's the stability challenge thing. If you go to herdingtigers.net, there's a video on there that explains basically the entire concept of stability challenge and all of that. And you can even just share that with your manager or whatever it is. But just, I would begin by saying, hey, I came across this concept. What do you think of this? And then letting them sort of articulate. Then you're putting them in the seat of power. You're not saying, you need to know this, but you're saying, hey, I'd just be curious to see what you think about this. Because it really resonated with me or whatever, just as a way to, so you're sharing ideas.
Yeah.
You're not telling them what to think or telling them they need management training, even though they very well may.
Can you repeat that website again?
Yeah, herdingtigers.net. If you go to herdingtigers.net, you can access that video.
Perfect. All right, let's do one more. What are the most effective ways? Oh, did I read that one already? No. Yes. What are the most effective ways that a leader can empower employees to take risks and not be afraid to fail? They're saying that to fail fast, but realistically, we might be willing for employees to fail, but we want them to fail with as little negative impact as possible. This is similar to kind of the one we answered before.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's right. I think, Seth Godin once said something, I can't remember where he was. It was in the context of something. I heard him speaking about it. He said, you always want to fail in the way that keeps you in the game. Never fail in the way that takes you out of the game. So when you are taking risks, and this is a good thing, a principle to teach your team, I think, is this the kind of risk that if we fail, we're going to be able to recover from, or is this the kind of risk that's going to take us out of the game? You don't want to do that. If you fail with this risk, are we going to lose the client that is 60% of our income right now, or whatever it is, right?
Sure.
Like, okay, let's think about that, because what we want are calculated risks. We don't want stupid risks. We want calculated risks. But I think that your team needs to, part of the stability challenge thing is your team needs to feel protected by you. So if a decision is made on your watch, if a decision is made by you to do a certain thing, they know that you're going to go to bat for them, that you're not going to throw them under the bus. If you want to lose your team's trust, and trust, by the way, we haven't even talked about trust, but trust is really kind of the central currency of all creative work, and really any kind of risky work. But you have to trust one another, and your team has to trust you in order to be able to function. But your team needs to know, hey, if you take a risk and you fail and it's on my watch, I've got your back. I'm going to take the arrows because we're making this decision together. I'm with you. Now, if you take a stupid risk that I'm unaware of and it's not a calculated risk and it was foolish for you to do that, I can't necessarily, I will still take arrows because you're on my team and I put you in that position. But but please don't surprise me in that way, right? Because we're on this together. So your team needs to know. So one manager told me when I was interviewing people for the book, one manager told me that an early mentor of hers said, make mistakes of commission, not omission. And number 2, believe that I have your back. And that's a 2-part thing, right? I want you to make aggressive mistakes, take aggressive risks. Don't fail because we didn't do something, fail because you tried something and it didn't work. And then when you fail, believe that I have your back. So when you fail, come to me and tell me right away that this didn't work, and we'll figure it out together. Because if I find out a week later, it's going to be a problem. So I think if you have that mindset where your team knows, I'm going to take arrows for you if this goes wrong, and I want you to go out there and do the things that I want you to do to take those risks. So I was then we're going to be okay. Sorry, I speak in non sequiturs a lot. I just kind of bounce. I was speaking at an Air Force base a couple of months ago, and one of the people at the Air Force base told me that one of the edicts of the base commander was, I want you to do something every day that you think will get me fired. I thought that's a pretty aggressive
Yeah.
move, but it signifies. What do you think that signifies to the people reporting? Like, hey, I want you to take risks. I want you to try things. I want you to go out and mess some stuff up.
Yeah.
Go out and break some stuff. A couple spoke to the team at Entree Leadership, Dave Ramsey's company, and one of the edicts, one of their cultural principles was, go out and break some stuff. It was something like, go out and break some stuff today, right? Because if you're not breaking stuff, you're probably being too careful.
Yeah.
So go out and break some stuff and see what happens. So it's tough to do that, but it all begins with you giving permission to your team to take risks, and then them knowing that you got their back. You're not gonna. If you want to lose your team's trust, throw them under the bus one time. You will never get it back. Never, ever, ever. And for generations of people to come, they will tell the story of how you threw your team under the bus, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to protect your team. If you're going to give permission to take risk, you have to own accountability for whatever happens under watch.
Yeah. So break some stuff, have their back, and do it in a way that doesn't take you out of the game.
There you go. That was so much more succinct. I think you just talked for like 10 minutes and you said it in like 3 sentences. Okay.
All right. We're going to do one more question. What is a good approach for new hires to use when approaching leadership on potential other creative tactics learned in school or other experiences?
So this is the person who is a new hire who's approaching their manager and wants to introduce some new ideas, some new tactics.
But maybe doesn't have a lot of past experience to go off.
So I would seek permission, okay? If you are new to an organization, you cannot approach your organizational superiors, I'm saying that, so your managers, with a mindset of like, well, let me show you some of the stuff that you can't do that. You have to come in with a seeking permission mindset. So if you're working on a project, go to your manager and say, hey, we have this thing we're trying to do. I would like to try this method that I think could work really well for us. First of all, I think your manager is going to see that and say, oh, some initiative here. That's great. You're out there, you're learning, you're trying. You don't have to say I learned it in school or what. Like you can, say, hey, I came across this method. I really would like to try this. It may or may not work, but I would like to try it because I think it's going to help us do things differently. Start in small ways. Experiment in small ways and seek permission at first to do it. Don't just jump in and start doing stuff, right? It depends on your manager. Maybe your manager would be fine with that. But if your manager is not the kind who's going to give you permission, or is not gonna overlook those little transgressions, seek permission and then begin experimenting in small ways. And often cultures are changed from the inside out, right? They're not changed from the top down. It's not like somebody comes across some big new principle and they say, from now on, I issue an edict that everything will be done this way. Typically, it's teams of people, little groups of people start doing things and other people catch on to it. And then pretty soon everybody's doing that thing. That's how a culture kind of spreads within an organization. So, my encouragement would be start small, seek permission, play around, find some low risk way to experiment with it. And if it works really well, report your results back to your manager and say, hey, we did this thing. It worked really, really well. Could we try it on this other thing that we're doing? And then when you do that, and then once people start seeing the results, then the results will speak for themselves. Listen, if it works, it's going to get done. Like it will be adopted if it works, most managers are pragmatists. Man, I mean, they want to get it done. So if it works, it's going to be adopted. So that would be my encouragement. Start small, seek permission, start small, report back the results, and then, kind of build from there.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we have time for. We're just coming up on 1:00. So thank you all so much for joining. We'll hold this up again. Todd Henry's book, Herding Tigers. Go out and get it, or we'll send an anonymous copy to your manager. Thank you so much, Todd, for being here.